So, the Mishna is setting up this rule about what happens when someone sells a field. Let's say you sell me a field, and you tell me it's a certain size. Let's use a beit core, which is a big plot of land. Now, maybe you measured it, but things aren't always perfectly exact. The Mishnah says that if it turns out the field is a little bit smaller or bigger than what you told me, that's fine, as long as the difference is less than 1/6 of the total size. So, if I buy the field and later find out it's a bit smaller, say 5% smaller, that's okay. The sale still stands, and we don't have to change anything. But if the field is off by more than 1/6, let's say it's way smaller than what you said, like 20% smaller, then you as the seller have to give me some money back to make up for it. Now, here's where the rabbis start debating in the Gemara. You've got Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda, and they're disagreeing about how to handle a difference that's exactly 1/6, right on the line. Rav Huna's take is, look, if the difference is exactly 1/6, that's still okay. It's basically like having a difference that's less than 1/6, so the sale stands, and no one has to return any money. He's saying it's within the acceptable range, but Rav Yehuda doesn't agree. He's more strict about it. He says no, if the difference is exactly 1/6, that's already a significant enough error that the seller needs to pay the buyer back. For him, the 1/6 mark is like a line in the sand. Once you hit it, there's an obligation to compensate the buyer. Now, why does this matter? Well, first of all, this is about fairness in business. The Talmud is acknowledging that in real life, people don't always measure things perfectly, and that's okay up to a point. So, if the error is small, like less than 1/6, we can just accept it as part of doing business. But if the error is bigger than that, the buyer is getting less than what they paid for, and the seller has to make it right. It's also about different ways of looking at mistakes. Rav Huna is more laid back. He's saying, hey, mistakes happen and a 1/6 difference isn't a big deal. But Rav Yehuda is stricter. He thinks that once you hit that 1/6 threshold, the buyer deserves some compensation. It's a debate about how precise we should be in holding people accountable. Another important point is this idea of responsibility. There's a story in the Gemara about Rav Pappa. He bought a field, and it turned out to be smaller than the seller had told him, like way smaller. So Rav Pappa goes to the Rabbi Abaye to complain, and Abaye basically tells him, look, you knew what you were buying, and you accepted it. You can't come back later and complain. This teaches us that if you know what you're getting into, and you still agree to the deal, you can't later cry foul about the size or other details. It's about being aware and responsible when making a purchase. So, to sum it up, this whole discussion is about balancing fairness with practicality. The Talmud understands that minor errors happen, but at a certain point, they become significant enough that the buyer should be compensated. It's about creating clear boundaries in business dealings to protect both the buyer and the seller. And it also teaches some ethical lessons about honesty, precision, and taking responsibility for your actions. So after that whole discussion about land measurements and fair sales, the text shifts gears to talk about a different scenario. What happens when brothers inherit land and need to split up their father's estate? This part introduces a new legal question. How do the brothers divide the land? And what happens if there's a surprise, like another brother suddenly showing up? First, there's this idea that when brothers split their father's estate, once they've divided the land through a lottery system, drawing lots to see who gets which portion, the division is final. That's it, no going back. The reason for this is tied to the way the land of Israel was divided among the tribes. When the Israelites first entered the land, the territories were divided by lottery, and that division was considered binding and final. The Gemara is saying that the same thing applies here. Once the lottery has decided who gets what, the brothers can't change their minds. But then the Gemara throws in a twist. It asks, okay, but what if a new brother shows up? Imagine two brothers have already split their father's land, but then a third brother who is living far away suddenly arrives and says, hey, I deserve a share of the estate too. This creates a real dilemma. There's a debate between two rabbis here as well, Rav and Shmuel. Rav says that if this happens, the original division of the land is completely void. Basically, the brothers have to start from scratch and redivide the estate among all three of them. In other words, once they discover that there's an additional heir, the previous division doesn't count anymore. Shmuel, on the other hand, takes a more moderate view. He says the original division still stands, but the two brothers who already got their shares just have to give a portion of their land to the third brother. They don't need to redo everything from the beginning. They just adjust things so that the new brother gets his fair share. The takeaway from this second half is about balancing the need for stability, like honoring the initial agreement, with the need for justice, where everyone gets their rightful share. This conversation also ties back to the earlier part about land sales and fairness, but here it's applied to inheritance, which was a big deal in ancient times, just like it is now. In the end, the Gemara wants us to think about how to be fair when things don't go as expected. Whether it's a surprise heir or a mismeasured field, the idea is to make sure that the legal outcome still reflects what's right, even when there are bumps along the way.